My name is Maya Vance. I'm 34 years old, and until 11 days ago, the worst thing that had ever happened to me at work was a client threatening to sue over a misfiled quarterly statement. I'm a senior forensic accountant at a mid-size firm in Seattle called Ashcroft and Reyes, the kind of place where nobody outside the industry has heard of us, but every hedge fund in the Pacific Northwest knows our name. I trace money. That's it. That's the whole job. Money moves and I follow it, the way a bloodhound follows a scent that everyone else has decided isn't there. I tell you this because you need to understand something before I tell you what happened on my porch. I am not a paranoid woman. I do not believe in conspiracies. I have spent 12 years building a reputation on cold, provable numbers, and I have never once, not in my entire career, let a feeling override a fact. That changed at 9:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in October. It had been raining since for that afternoon, the kind of steady Seattle rain that doesn't announce itself, just settles into your bones. My husband, Logan, was upstairs putting our daughter Chloe to bed. She's 7. She'd lost her second tooth that morning and insisted on leaving it under her pillow, in case the tooth fairy is running early this month, which is a sentence only a 7-year-old could say with a straight face. I was in the kitchen finishing a glass of wine when I heard it. A soft thud on the porch. Not a knock. Not the mail slot. Just a single, heavy sound, like something had been set down rather than dropped. I looked through the side window first. Nobody there. No car in the driveway that wasn't ours. No footsteps retreating down the block, at least none I could see through the rain-streaked glass. I unlocked the door and opened it, and that's when I saw it. A matte black box, roughly the size of a shoebox, sitting dead center on our welcome mat. No packaging tape. No shipping label. No return address. Just a smooth, almost military-looking case with a single seam running around the lid, like something engineered rather than manufactured. I want to be honest with you. My first thought wasn't fear. My first thought was irritation, because I assumed it was some Amazon mix-up, a package left at the wrong house. I actually crouched down and picked it up before some quieter, older part of my brain, the part that had spent a decade reading financial statements written by people trying very hard to hide something, told me to stop. There was a card taped to the top. Cream cardstock, handwritten in blue ink, the letters slanted and deliberate. The debt is due. I stood there on my own porch in the rain, holding a box I now suddenly did not want to be holding, and I called for Logan. He came down in his socks, still in the t-shirt he wears to read Chloe her bedtime story, and when he saw my face he didn't ask what was wrong. He just said, "Put it down, Maya. Put it down right now." We set it on the porch table. Logan has a healthy paranoia that I used to tease him about. He's a software engineer. He thinks in terms of attack surfaces and unauthorized access, and for years I found it a little exhausting, honestly, the way he'd double-check the smart lock app before bed like our house was a bank vault. That night, for the first time in our marriage, I was grateful for it. He didn't open the box. He photographed it from 4 angles with his phone, then he called 911, and I remember thinking, even then, that his hands weren't shaking. Mine were. The dispatcher asked routine questions. Unexpected package. No label. Handwritten note. She said officers were on their way, and to please not open it, and I remember laughing, actually laughing, a short, ugly, frightened sound, because I thought, this is absurd, this is going to turn out to be nothing, some prank, some overzealous marketing stunt for a true crime podcast. It took 11 minutes for the patrol car to arrive. In those 11 minutes, Logan and I stood on the porch in the rain, not touching the box, not touching each other, just watching it the way you watch a pot you're not sure is actually going to boil. The 2 officers who arrived were young, and at first they treated it the way you'd expect, mildly concerned, professionally polite, the kind of call that ends in an apologetic shrug and a suggestion to check our neighbors' cameras. One of them, a woman with a flashlight, crouched down to examine the seam of the box without opening it. Then she went still. She said something into her shoulder radio that I didn't catch, and 30 seconds later, both officers had their hands on their holsters, and the male officer was physically moving Logan and me backward, off our own porch, down the steps, onto the wet grass of our front yard. "Ma'am, sir, I need you both to step back to the sidewalk. Now, please." Logan asked what was happening. Neither officer answered. The woman got back on her radio, and this time I heard the words she used, clipped and precise, the kind of words that are designed to sound calm specifically because the situation isn't. Requesting cybercrimes and bomb squad advisory. Possible active device. Residence, not the box. The residence. Not the box. That's when I understood, standing barefoot in wet grass in front of my own house at 10 o'clock at night, that whatever this was, it hadn't started with a package on my porch. It had started somewhere inside my home, and none of us had noticed it happening. Detective Marcus Vance arrived 20 minutes later, no relation, despite the name, a coincidence he'd later joke about more than once, trying to break the tension in a room. He was younger than I expected for someone with his title, mid-40s maybe, wearing a jacket that had clearly been thrown on over pajama pants, called in from home. He didn't rush toward the box. He walked the perimeter of the porch first, eyes on the house, not the package. "Ms. Vance. Mr. Vance. I need you to think very carefully. Has anyone had physical access to your home in the last 30 days who isn't normally here? Contractors, repair technicians, anyone?" I said no. Logan hesitated, just for a second, just long enough that I noticed it and filed it away without understanding why. "No," he said. "No one." Marcus knelt beside the box, put on gloves, and with a tool I didn't recognize, carefully lifted the lid without disturbing whatever was inside. I will remember what I saw for the rest of my life. A smartphone, screen on, propped upright inside a foam cutout shaped exactly to hold it. And on that screen, in crystal clear resolution, a live video feed. Our daughter's bedroom. Chloe, asleep in her bed, one arm thrown over her stuffed rabbit, the night light casting its soft amber glow across the wall exactly the way it does every single night. Someone was watching my daughter sleep. Right now. In real time. And they had left the evidence of it on my porch like a gift. Beside the phone, a small brass key, old-fashioned, the kind that belongs to a physical lock rather than anything digital. And tucked into the foam beneath it, a second card, same handwriting. "You have something that isn't yours. I want it back." I don't remember screaming, but Logan told me later that I did, once, short and sharp, before I clamped my hand over my own mouth because some instinct told me that whoever was on the other end of that live feed could probably hear me too. Marcus didn't touch the phone. He barked an order into his radio, and within 90 seconds, 4 more officers had cleared us fully off the property, and AK-9 unit was walking the perimeter of our house while a second team went, weapons drawn, through our own front door. We stood at the end of our driveway, my husband's arm locked around my shoulders so tight it almost hurt, and we watched flashlight beams move room to room through the windows of the house where our daughter was sleeping, completely unaware that 6 armed strangers were now inside her home looking for something that could hurt her. It took them 14 minutes to find the first camera. It was hidden inside the smart thermostat in our hallway, a device Logan had installed himself 8 months earlier, the kind of thing you buy because it's convenient and never think about again. The second was inside the soundbar beneath our living room TV. The third, and this is the one that broke something in me that I don't think has fully healed since, was wedged behind the stuffing of Chloe's stuffed rabbit, the same one she'd had her arm thrown over 30 minutes earlier while a stranger watched her breathe. Each device was running on its own independent battery pack. No Wi-Fi signature. No connection to our home network at all. Which meant, Marcus explained quietly, pulling us aside on the sidewalk while his team bagged the evidence, that whoever did this hadn't hacked us remotely. They had been inside our house. Physically. More than once. With enough time and enough access to hide 3 separate devices in 3 separate rooms without either of us ever noticing. "Ms. Vance," Marcus said, and for the first time that night his professional calm cracked just slightly, just enough for me to see the concern underneath it. "I need you to think about your work. Is there anything, any case, any client, any file, that someone might consider valuable enough to do this? I opened my mouth to say no. I work in forensic accounting. I trace fraud. I don't work with people who install military-grade surveillance equipment inside stuffed animals. And then I thought about the file sitting on my encrypted drive at the office. 6 months of buried transactions. Shell companies nested inside shell companies. A client engagement that had started as a routine audit and had, over the past 2 months, turned into something I hadn't told anyone about yet, not my supervising partner, not the SEC, and not my own husband. A number so large it had taken me 3 separate spreadsheets just to hold it. I looked at Logan, standing there soaked in the rain with his arm still around me, and for one long, cold second, I didn't see my husband of 9 years. I saw someone who had hesitated, just slightly, when a detective asked if anyone unfamiliar had been inside our home. There's something, I told Marcus. But I need to know first. Who has been coming into my house? Nobody answered me. Not that night. And it would be 3 more days before I found out that the person who'd had a key to our home this entire time wasn't a stranger at all. He was family. 3 days after the box, our house didn't feel like ours anymore. Detective Marcus Vance had a forensics team sweep every outlet, every vent, every seam in the drywall, twice. They found nothing more, which should have felt like relief. It didn't. It felt like waiting for the other shoe to drop in a house where you no longer trusted the floor. Chloe was staying with my sister in Tacoma. I hadn't told her why. I'd told her it was a grown-up house project, and she'd accepted that the way 7-year-olds accept most adult explanations, with mild suspicion and a request for more screen time in exchange for cooperation. I gave it to her. I would have given her anything that week. Logan and I were sleeping in shifts. Not because anyone told us to. Because neither of us could fall asleep at the same time without one of us lying awake, staring at the bedroom door, listening for a sound that never came. It was on the second night of this arrangement that I finally asked him the question I'd been circling for 3 days. Logan. Who has a key to this house? He was sitting on the edge of our bed, still dressed, elbows on his knees. He didn't answer right away, and I watched him not answer, and something in my chest went very cold and very still. You, me, your sister for emergencies, he said. The lockbox code for the cleaning service. That's it. That's not what I asked. I asked who has a key. Not who's supposed to. He looked up at me then, and for the first time in 9 years of marriage, I saw my husband look genuinely afraid of a question I'd asked him. There's someone, he said. I should have told the detective already. I should have told you the day it happened, not 3 days later. I want to be transparent about something. In my line of work, I have interviewed enough people who were about to confess something they'd been sitting on to know the tells. The throat clearing. The hands moving to the knees like they need something solid to hold on to. Logan did both. His name is Julian, he said. Julian Sterling. He's my brother. I had been married to this man for 9 years. I had met his mother twice before she passed. I had seen photographs from his childhood, a lake house in Michigan, a dog named Biscuit, a school science fair ribbon he still kept in a drawer. Not once in 9 years had he mentioned a brother. I don't have a brother, Logan said quickly, seeing my face. That's not, I mean, legally, biologically, yes. But we grew up in different houses after our parents split when I was 6. Different last names, even. Our mother remarried, I took her new husband's name. Julian stayed with our father and kept his. We saw each other maybe 4 times after that. The last time was 11 years ago, at our father's funeral, and it ended with him telling me I was, and I'm quoting him exactly, the version of this family that got to pretend the rest of us didn't exist. And he has a key to our house. He came by 8 months ago. Said he wanted to reconnect. Said he was in town for work and wanted to see how I turned out. I gave him a spare key so he could water the plants when we went to Portland for your cousin's wedding. I never asked for it back. I didn't think about it again until 3 nights ago. 8 months. The same 8 months, I would later learn that the smart thermostat had been installed. The same window in which, according to the forensics report Marcus would show us 2 days later, all 3 surveillance devices had first begun transmitting. I didn't sleep that night either. Not because I was afraid of Julian Sterling, a man I'd never met. I lay awake because I was afraid of the version of my husband who had kept a stranger's key hanging on our kitchen hook for 8 months, and never once mentioned his existence. Marcus called us into the precinct the next morning, and this time his tone had changed. Less procedural. More urgent. We ran the device signatures, he said, sliding a folder across the table. These aren't consumer-grade cameras. The chipsets are the kind used in closed-loop military surveillance networks. Encrypted, air-gapped, untraceable through any commercial ISP. Whoever built these had access to hardware that isn't available to the public. Not on Amazon, not on the dark web, nowhere. Meaning what? I asked. Meaning whoever did this either works for, or has worked for, an organization with serious technical infrastructure. Defense contractor. Intelligence-adjacent private security. Or, he paused here, watching my face carefully, a corporation with enough money to buy access to that kind of hardware quietly. I felt my stomach drop before my brain had even finished processing the sentence, because I already knew where this was going. 2 months earlier, I had been assigned to a routine compliance audit for a firm called Halcyon Meridian Group, a Seattle-based technology and logistics conglomerate with revenue north of $4 billion a year. What started as a standard quarterly review had turned, over 11 weeks, into something else entirely. I had found 17 shell entities registered across 3 states and 2 offshore jurisdictions, all funneling unexplained transfers back into Halcyon's core accounts. The number I'd calculated, as of the previous Friday, was $340 million in laundered capital, disguised as consulting fees, licensing agreements, and strategic partnership payments to companies that, when I checked, didn't have a single employee, a single office, or a single verifiable client. I had told exactly 2 people about this. My supervising partner, Richard Ashcroft, and as of 11 days ago, nobody else. Not the SEC. Not even Logan, because I'd wanted to be certain before I brought this kind of accusation into our home. There's a case, I told Marcus quietly. I've been building it for 2 months. Nobody outside my firm knows the details. How big? Big enough that if I'm right, it ends careers. Maybe criminal charges. Maybe both. Marcus wrote something down and didn't look up. Ms. Vance, I need the name of that company. Today. Not because I doubt your judgment. Because if there's a connection, we need to move before they realize we're looking. I gave him the name. Halcyon Meridian Group. I watched something shift behind his eyes, the specific look of a man cross-referencing a name against something he already half-suspected. That's the same company, he said slowly, that Julian Sterling's private security consulting firm has done contract work for. Twice. Over the last 3 years. The room went very quiet. Here is what I didn't know yet, and what I wouldn't learn in full until 6 days later, sitting across from a federal prosecutor with a folder of evidence between us thick enough to require its own chair. Julian Sterling was not, as Logan believed, a freelance IT consultant living a modest life in Bellevue. Julian Sterling ran a boutique private intelligence firm, 3 employees, no public website, contracts paid in wire transfers routed through 2 intermediary shell accounts that specialized in exactly one service: making problems disappear for clients who could afford total discretion. Halcyon Meridian Group had been his client for 14 months. Not for cybersecurity. Not for consulting. For something the invoices, when investigators finally subpoenaed them, listed only as reputational risk mitigation. I was the risk. Julian hadn't installed those cameras to spy on his brother out of some twisted family jealousy, the way I'd first assumed lying awake that second sleepless night. He had installed them because 8 months ago, around the same time, he'd asked Logan for a spare key under the guise of reconnecting. Halcyon's internal counsel had discovered that the forensic accountant assigned to their compliance audit happened to share a last name, a city, and a home address with the estranged brother of one of their contracted security specialists. It wasn't a coincidence they'd discovered. It was one they'd engineered. Someone at Halcyon had gone looking for a way to control the auditor threatening to expose $340 million in laundered funds, and they had found, sitting right there in their own contractor's family tree, a man willing to do almost anything to prove to a father who was already dead, and a brother who barely remembered him, that he mattered. The cameras weren't there to blackmail me directly. Not yet. They were there to build a file. Every conversation, every late-night work session, every argument Logan and I had ever had in the privacy of our own home, quietly catalogued, waiting for the moment Halcyon's lawyers needed material to discredit me, or worse, to construct a narrative in which I was the one who had done something wrong. That moment, I would soon discover, was already scheduled. A federal emergency hearing, filed under seal, in which Halcyon's legal team intended to petition for an emergency asset freeze against me personally, using surveillance footage they claimed proved I had been secretly selling audit findings to a competing firm. Footage that didn't exist. Until Julian created it. I found out about the hearing the same afternoon Marcus told us who had been living behind the key on our kitchen hook, and when I asked him how much time we had before it happened, he looked at the folder on the table between us for a long moment before answering. 4 days, he said. And Ms. Vance, there's something else in this file you need to see before you leave this room. Something about the day the cameras were installed. It isn't just your brother-in-law's fingerprints on the thermostat. He turned the folder around and slid it toward me, and I saw, in the corner of an internal Halcyon security log dated 8 months earlier, a second name authorizing Julian's building access that afternoon. A name I recognized instantly, because it belonged to someone who had sat across from me in a conference room 3 separate times over the past 2 months, smiling, offering coffee, asking careful questions about how my audit was progressing. Someone who worked, officially, for my own accounting firm. The name on the security log was Diane Kowalski. I sat with that folder open in front of me for almost a full minute before I said anything, because I needed my voice to be steady when I did. Diane had been my direct supervisor's assistant for 6 years. She was the woman who brought me coffee when I worked late. She was the woman who'd sent Chloe a stuffed elephant when she was born, who asked every Monday how our weekend had gone, who'd sat across from me in conference room for be exactly 3 times over the past 2 months, ostensibly to help coordinate scheduling for the Halcyon audit, and who had, according to the log in front of me, badged Julian Sterling into our own firm's parking garage on a Tuesday evening 8 months ago. She has access to the garage, I said slowly, thinking out loud. Not the office. The garage doesn't connect to the file servers. It doesn't need to, Marcus said. It connects to the elevator, which connects to the floor where you keep your physical files. Ms. Vance, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. In the last 2 months, has anything about your work environment felt different? Anything at all? I almost said no. And then I remembered something I'd dismissed at the time as nothing, a small administrative annoyance I hadn't thought about since. 6 weeks earlier, my office key card had stopped working for exactly 1 day. I'd needed Diane to badge me in and out 3 separate times, apologizing each time, blaming it on a system update IT was rolling out. I'd believed her because why wouldn't I? IT sends emails about system updates constantly. Nobody reads them. I told Marcus this, and he wrote it down without comment, but I saw his jaw tighten. That's how they got physical access to your workstation, he said. Not your home. Your office. If your keycard was disabled for a day, and she had to badge you in personally, that means she also had unsupervised access to your desk during that window. I thought about what lived on that desk. Printed drafts of my Halcyon findings. Handwritten notes I hadn't yet transferred to the encrypted system, because some habits from 12 years in this industry never go away. I still like to think with a pen before I trust a keyboard. Notes that, if photographed, would have given someone at Halcyon a 2-month head start on exactly what I'd found, and more dangerously, exactly what I hadn't found yet. This was the moment the case stopped being about my house. Phase 5 of what happened to my family, if I'm being honest with you, wasn't the box on the porch. It was the isolation that followed it, the quiet, grinding realization that I could no longer trust the people I'd built my professional life around. I couldn't tell my supervising partner, Richard Ashcroft, what we'd found, because I no longer knew whether Richard himself was involved, or whether Diane had been acting entirely on her own, feeding information upward without his knowledge. I couldn't ask my coworkers casual questions without wondering which of them might mention it to the wrong person over lunch. I stopped bringing my laptop into the office at all. I started working from a rented room above a coffee shop in Ballard that nobody at my firm knew existed, driving there in my sister's car instead of my own, because Marcus had warned us, gently but firmly, that until the hearing, we needed to assume that anything moving through our normal patterns was potentially visible to someone. Logan was worse off than I was, in a way I hadn't fully understood until that week. He wasn't just isolated from coworkers. He was isolated from his own history. Every memory he had of Julian, a difficult older brother, distant but not dangerous, someone who'd shown up at their father's funeral angry and grieving and human, had to be re-examined now through the lens of a man capable of installing military-grade surveillance equipment inside his 7-year-old niece's stuffed rabbit. I keep trying to remember if there was a moment, he told me one night, sitting in the dark of the coffee shop after closing, the owner having given us a key out of a strange, quiet kindness once Marcus vouched for us. A moment where I should have seen this coming. And I can't find one. That's what scares me. Either I missed something, or there was nothing to miss, and he became this on his own, somewhere I couldn't see. I didn't have an answer for him. I still don't, entirely. The discovery that changed the shape of everything came 4 days before the hearing, delivered not by Marcus, but by an unexpected source, a forensic financial analyst named Priya Nair, a specialist Marcus had brought in from the FBI's Seattle field office once the case crossed from local surveillance into federal wire fraud territory. Priya had been given everything, the Halcyon Shell Company data I'd compiled, the device logs from our house, the security badge records from my office, and critically, a warrant that allowed federal investigators to examine Julian Sterling's business accounts directly. What she found reframed the entire case. Julian's firm hadn't simply been hired to surveil me. Over the preceding 6 weeks, Halcyon's general counsel, a man named Preston Locke, had begun wiring Julian additional payments under a separate contract line item labeled Special Media Production Services. $14,000, then $22,000, then a final payment of $60,000, deposited 9 days before the box appeared on our porch. Priya's working theory, and it would prove correct, was that this money hadn't paid for surveillance at all. It had paid for fabrication. Julian, using footage stitched together from the very cameras hidden in our home, along with deepfake audio synthesis technology his firm had quietly developed for exactly this kind of work, had been building a false narrative. A version of events in which audio clips of my own voice, pulled from real conversations and digitally rearranged, would appear to show me discussing the sale of confidential audit findings to a rival firm called Brentwood Analytics, a company that, as it happened, existed only on paper, another Halcyon-controlled shell entity created for the sole purpose of giving the fabricated footage a destination to point to. It was, Priya told us in a conference room that smelled like burnt coffee and old carpet, one of the most sophisticated pieces of synthetic evidence she had encountered in 11 years with the Bureau. If this had gone to the hearing unchallenged, she said, a judge would have frozen your assets within the hour, Ms. Vance. Possibly issued a warrant. You would have spent the 4 days before any of us could prove it was fake sitting in a holding cell, while your own credibility as a witness in the Halcyon fraud case was permanently destroyed. That was the entire point. Not to convict you. To discredit you so thoroughly that nothing you'd found about the $340 million would ever be admissible again. I sat with that for a long moment. 9 years of marriage, and I had never once considered that the man my husband barely spoke to, a stranger at holidays, a name mentioned only in passing, would end up holding the fate of my career, my freedom, and possibly my family in a folder of doctored audio clips. This is the part of the story where, if you've been watching stories like this for a while, you'd expect me to tell you we panicked. That we spent those 4 days paralyzed, waiting to be ambushed by evidence we couldn't disprove. We didn't have that luxury, and honestly, panic has never been useful to me in 12 years of this job. So instead, Logan did something I hadn't fully appreciated about him until that week, something that made me understand, finally, why he'd never once needed to raise his voice to feel like a partner in this marriage rather than a passenger in it. He started tracing the signal. The cameras were air-gapped from our home network, true, but air-gapped doesn't mean invisible. Every one of those independent battery packs still needed to transmit its footage somewhere, on some schedule, using some frequency. Logan spent 2 nights in that coffee shop with 3 monitors borrowed from a friend at his old job, cross-referencing packet capture data the FBI had pulled from our house against public spectrum allocation records, looking for a signature that matched. On the second night, at 2:14 in the morning, he found it. A repeating transmission window, for minutes long, occurring every 6 hours, broadcasting on a private frequency registered, through 3 layers of shell ownership, to a leased server room in a nondescript office park in Renton. 15 minutes from our house. A location that, according to public business filings, belonged to nobody. No company name. No listed tenant. Just a single access badge history, subpoenaed the following morning, showing one man entering and exiting that server room every day for the past 8 months, always alone, always between the hours of 11 p.m. and 1 a.m. Julian. We finally knew where he was. And 4 days before Halcyon's lawyers planned to destroy my life in a federal courtroom using footage that didn't exist, Logan looked at me across 3 borrowed monitors and said the first thing either of us had said all week that sounded like hope instead of fear. I think I know how to get inside that server room's live feed. And I think I know exactly what we're going to show the judge instead. The federal courthouse in downtown Seattle has a particular kind of silence to it in the morning before a hearing, a hush that has nothing to do with respect and everything to do with fear. I'd been in courtrooms before, always on the winning side, always as the woman with the spreadsheets nobody could argue with. I had never once sat in the gallery as the accused. Halcyon Meridian Group had sent 4 attorneys. For an emergency asset freeze against a single forensic accountant. I remember thinking, sitting there in a blazer I'd chosen specifically because it made me feel like a professional, and not a suspect, that the sheer size of their legal response was its own kind of confession. You don't send 4 attorneys after someone you actually believe is guilty of something small. Preston Locke, Halcyon's general counsel, sat at the plaintiff's table with the calm, faintly bored expression of a man who has done this exact maneuver before and expects it to work again. He didn't look at me once during the opening statements. I understood, watching him, that to him I wasn't a person. I was a line item that needed to be resolved before the quarter closed. Their argument was simple and, I'll admit, well constructed. They alleged that I had accessed privileged Halcyon financial data during my audit and covertly transferred audit methodology and preliminary findings to Brentwood Analytics, a fictitious rival firm, in exchange for a future position and a 6-figure signing bonus. As proof, they submitted audio recordings, 3 clips, each under 90 seconds, each featuring my voice discussing exactly this arrangement in what sounded, chillingly, like my own office, in what sounded like my own words. I sat perfectly still while they played the first clip. I want to be honest with you about how it felt, because I think anyone watching this deserves the truth rather than a clean, heroic version of events. It felt like listening to a stranger wearing my voice like a coat. I recognized my own inflection, the specific way I clear my throat before a difficult sentence, a tic I've had since college. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that I had never said a single word of what I was hearing. Judge Elena Marsh, a woman in her 60s with the kind of unhurried patience that made every attorney in the room slightly nervous, listened to all 3 clips without expression. When they finished, she turned to my attorney, a sharp, quiet woman named Renata Ford whom Marcus had recommended 2 days earlier, and asked whether the defense wished to respond. Renata stood. Your Honor, before I respond, I'd like to request the court's permission to introduce a competing piece of evidence. We believe it directly addresses the authenticity of what the court just heard. Locke was already objecting before she finished the sentence, something about improper notice, discovery violations, the usual mechanics attorneys use to keep an unwelcome truth out of a room. Judge Marsh held up one hand, and the room went quiet again. "Counsel," she said, looking at Renata, "you have 30 seconds to convince me this isn't a stunt." "Your Honor, the audio just played was generated using synthetic voice technology, built from real recordings of my client stolen through unauthorized surveillance devices installed inside her home. We have traced the origin of that surveillance to a private server currently transmitting live, less than 15 miles from this courthouse. With the court's permission, we would like to show you what that server is transmitting right now." Locke stood so fast his chair scraped audibly against the floor. "Your Honor, this is—" "Sit down, Mr. Locke," Judge Marsh said, without raising her voice at all, which somehow made it land harder than shouting would have. "I want to see it. This is the moment, if you've made it this far, that I think you've been waiting for, and I promise you, living through it felt exactly as strange as it's about to sound." Logan had spent the previous 2 nights, alongside Marcus, Priya Nair, and a federal technical analyst none of us had met until 48 hours earlier, quietly establishing a monitored, legally authorized connection into the transmission. Julian's server room had been broadcasting for 8 months. This wasn't hacking, though it would have looked like it to anyone watching. Every step had been done under an emergency federal warrant, obtained the night before based on Priya's affidavit regarding the fabricated evidence. What Logan had built wasn't an intrusion. It was a live window into a room a judge was about to be shown, with full legal authority, in real time. The courtroom's projector screen flickered, and instead of the polished, professionally lit conference room Halcyon's attorneys had clearly expected, because they had, in fact, requested the ability to project their own supporting materials moments earlier, giving Logan and Renata the exact access window they needed, the room saw something else entirely. A cramped, windowless server room. Racks of blinking equipment. A single desk cluttered with monitors, cables, and a half-finished energy drink. And a man standing at that desk, his back to the angle of the camera feed, but unmistakably present, actively deleting files from an external drive while glancing repeatedly at his phone. Detective Marcus Vance, who had been sitting quietly in the gallery until this exact moment, stood and addressed the judge directly, his voice carrying the particular calm of a man who has waited a long time to say something out loud. "Your Honor, that individual is Julian Sterling. Federal agents are currently en route to his physical location, confirmed via GPS triangulation of his personal device, at a motel 11 minutes from that server room. He is not aware this feed is being observed." The room watched in total silence, as Julian Sterling continued deleting files from a hard drive he believed no one was watching, while a federal judge, 2 attorneys, a forensic accountant, and a gallery of exactly 9 strangers observed him doing it live, in real time, from a courtroom 15 miles away. Preston Locke did not object again. "I watched him instead, and I will tell you honestly, it was one of the most satisfying things I have ever witnessed, watching a man's entire practiced composure dissolve in under 4 seconds as he realized precisely what he was looking at, and precisely what it meant for the company that had been paying him." Judge Marsh let the feed run for nearly 2 full minutes before she spoke. "Ms. Ford, I'm denying the plaintiff's motion for an emergency asset freeze in its entirety. I am also referring this matter, along with everything just shown to this court, to the United States Attorney's Office for review of potential fraud upon this tribunal, evidence tampering, and unlawful surveillance." She turned to Locke. "Counselor, I strongly suggest you contact whoever authorized this filing before you leave this building today." Julian Sterling was arrested 40 minutes later, at a Motel 6 off Interstate 405, still holding the external drive he'd been trying to wipe. Federal agents recovered enough unencrypted backup files, stored on a secondary device he hadn't expected anyone to find, to reconstruct the entire fabrication timeline, including internal Halcyon emails authorizing the deepfake audio production and wiring the payments Priya Nair had already traced. Preston Locke was indicted 11 days later on charges of obstruction of justice, wire fraud, and conspiracy to tamper with a federal proceeding. 2 additional Halcyon executives, including the company's chief financial officer, were indicted alongside him once my original audit findings, the The $340 million in laundered transfers were formally entered into the federal case as the underlying motive. Diane Kowalski was terminated from Ashcroft and Reyes the same week. She was never criminally charged. Investigators concluded she had been paid a relatively modest sum, $8,000, to grant garage access on 2 occasions, likely without fully understanding the scale of what she was enabling. I think about that more than I expected to. Not everyone involved in something monstrous understands at the time that it's monstrous. Some people just take an envelope and don't ask enough questions. I don't know if that makes it better or worse. I've decided it doesn't matter which. Julian pleaded guilty 4 months later to reduce his sentence, avoiding a trial that would have kept our family's name in the news for another year. He is currently serving 6 years in federal custody. Logan visited him once, alone, 3 weeks after the sentencing. He didn't tell me everything that was said in that room, and I didn't ask him to. Some things belong only to the people who lived them. What he did tell me was this: Julian didn't say sorry. He said, "I finally did something our father would have noticed." Logan said he sat with that sentence for a long time, after he left the visitation room, in his car, before he could make himself drive home. We moved 8 months later, not out of fear, but because Chloe deserved a house that didn't have 3 empty spots in its walls where cameras used to be, spots we could still see if we looked hard enough, patched but never quite invisible. Our new house is smaller. It has a porch, too. Some nights I still look at it before I go to sleep, just to check, and I've stopped being embarrassed about that habit, because I think anyone who lived through what we lived through would do the same thing. Halcyon Meridian Group settled with federal prosecutors for $412 million, the largest corporate fraud settlement in the state's history that year. My name was in the papers for exactly 9 days before the news cycle moved on to something else, which was, honestly, exactly what I wanted. I never wanted to be famous for this. I wanted to be right, and I wanted my daughter to be safe, and eventually, slowly, I got both. Logan left his corporate engineering job 6 weeks after the hearing. He works independently now, mostly with families and small firms who've experienced exactly the kind of surveillance we did, helping them find what's hidden in their own walls before it cost them what it almost cost us. He says it's the first work he's ever done that feels like it matters more than the paycheck attached to it. Chloe is 8 now. She still has the stuffed rabbit. We had it professionally cleaned, every seam checked twice by people Marcus personally recommended, before we let her hold it again. She doesn't remember most of what happened that year. She remembers, she told me recently, that the year Daddy learned to be a detective too. I've decided to let her keep that version of it. It isn't wrong. It's just kinder than the whole truth, and some kindnesses are worth keeping. I still work in forensic accounting. I still trace money, the way I always have, following the trail nobody else wants to look at closely enough to see. But I keep a small, framed photograph on my desk now, a picture of that matte black box, taken by Logan's phone the night it first appeared on our porch, before anyone touched it, before we knew what it would cost us, or what it would eventually give back. People ask me sometimes why I keep it. Why hold onto a photograph of the worst night of your life? I tell them the truth. Because it's the last photograph taken of my family before we knew how strong we actually were. And some nights, when the house is quiet and Chloe is asleep upstairs with a rabbit that has nothing hidden inside it anymore, I look at that photograph, and I think about how close we came to losing everything to a debt that was never really ours to pay. It was theirs. And in the end, they were the ones who paid it.